Today we're going to talk about plotting. This is going to be a short lecture. You guys should be continuing your workshop, and I do have some homework for you at the end. So we'll keep this portion short. We'll go into longer plotting lecture next class. Plot is your story's map. It's essentially how you get from point A to point B in your script or in your creative nonfiction or in your fiction. It answers the question for the reader, what happens next? What changes? Ultimately, plot should not be stagnant, and we'll look at something that is stagnant to demonstrate that for you. Something must change to get the plot or the characters or something to move past point A to point B. What is changing? It can be physical movement, as in changing locations, change in goals, change in relationship, change in character, hopefully growth, change in readers' understanding, and the realization that nothing will change, which is essentially the definition of a tragedy. We're going to look at each one of these individually and see what that looks like in the course of a plot. Physical movement. So this is really just getting a character from point A to point B. And in a larger plot, it might look something like this. So when you open up in point A, we have a mob boss killing civilians and police in an urban setting. And at the end of the plot, you have a police officer killing the mob boss in a secluded setting in the hideaway. So you can see point A to point B moves them physically from the urban setting to the secluded setting, but it also brings about change for those characters. And so oftentimes, even though I'm talking about each of these individually, they ultimately work together. And you can have multiple things, and you should maybe having multiple things happen at one time. Changing in goals. So from point A to point B, whether that's a scene or the entire book or act one, there should be a change in the character's goals. So if at point A, you have a character who's a former mob wife who wants to be left alone, safe with her son. At point B, her goals may change. Character takes down her ex, and her goal moves to reintegrating into the real world and having finally that safety for her son. So you can see by making a change in the goal here, it can also change the endpoint for the character. Change in relationship, and this doesn't have to mean romantic relationships, not that there's anything wrong with that, but there's lots of ways relationships can change. For instance, if at point A they dislike each other, in point B they're in love, and again that doesn't have to be true love like romance, but really the relationship becoming more or less antagonistic. So in Wall Street, there's sort of this hate-hate relationship between father and son, and that becomes less antagonistic in the storyline, which changes the son's relationship with his mentor and supervisor. You can also have characters in a relationship who decide to break up. There's an old movie, Kramer versus Kramer, the movie The Breakup, but that is a change in relationship. Breaking up is part of having children, a changing work dynamic. All of those are part of changing in relationships. Character growth. So if in point A you have a character who's a selfish jerk, by point B that character should be less selfish. There's a movie by Shirley MacLaine that came out just in the last couple of years. It's called The Last Word. And she is an exceptionally selfish person. And in fact, a lot of her recent stuff is probably has her as being somebody kind of selfish as a character. And so the idea with character growth is that they become a better person and are less selfish. Hopefully that works out. Reader understanding. So your readers may have a change in the way they perceive things. Oftentimes, that's when there's a twist, right? So in point A, the reader thinks that the character is the murderer. We've had several movies that are like that. And by point B, the reader or the viewer, if it's a movie, may understand that that character is actually innocent. The movie A Perfect Murder which is based on a really, really old movie, Dial M for Murder. That's the way you start out, and you really think that that character is the murderer, and you don't realize till towards the end that it's an innocent person defending themselves. Pretty much any Quentin Tarantino movie has this kind of twist, and so the change isn't in the character so much as it is in the reader or the viewer and how they perceive that character as new evidence comes to light. Tragedy. Tragedy is the realization that nothing will change. In point A, for example, the character wants to leave his small town. We talked about the movie It's a Wonderful Life in one of these other lectures, and the character wants to leave town. That's the ultimate crux of his dissatisfaction with life. And in point B, the character is shown he can never leave town. Now, in A Wonderful Life, his situation doesn't change, but he is no longer unhappy with his situation because he recognizes that he did, in fact, make an impact on people's lives by not moving locations. Now, a bad example, and this is, one of my least favorite movies, Tin Cup with Kevin Costner. He starts out as sort of this loser who's a golf pro, and you find out over the course of the movie that he once had a chance at the big time, but instead he gets to the very last hole and he makes this tragic error. And in the very end of the movie, he's in the exact same situation and he makes the exact same mistake. And so there's no change in his behavior. There's no character growth. There's nothing that's changed for him. So that is, in fact, a tragedy. When you're looking at your stories, what I want you to ask in a scene or in a book or in a short story is, do your characters move from point A to point B? And if there is no change, why is the scene there? And so the same with the short story. If you remember back to Click Clack by Neil Gaiman, there is a change, right? The character is this teenage boy, maybe early 20s, we don't have a sense, taking care of his girlfriend's younger sibling. And by the time we get to the end of the story, a lot has changed. So ask those questions of your story. What's changed? Did the character move from point A to B? And if not, why is the scene there? Other questions to ask is, what are your character's flaws and problems? Because those big changes that we're looking about should come forth in the flaws and problems, and they're either going to improve their character and show character growth, or those flaws are going to keep drawing them downward until they do overcome their flaws. So what type of life problems would be difficult for your character? If you have a character who is an alcoholic and you have him or her in a scene where they have to go into a bar to interrogate a suspect, that might be a real life problem for a real life alcoholic. So always figure out what your character's flaws and problems are and put that into the plot. That's part of complicating their life and helping them get to from point A and to point B. Next class, we're going to talk a lot about 3-act structure, but I do want to give you a brief reminder of the 3-act structure so that when we go into the homework assignment and we go into the lecture next class, you have a basis to start with. The 3-act structure is a model used in narrative fiction. Frequently, it is used in script writing that divides the story into 3 parts, and they're called, and you can kind of see in this graphic here, you've got the setup, which it shows as exposition, the confrontation, which should hit the midpoint, and then we've got a climax here, and in Act 3, we should have a resolution. Between the individual acts, so you can kind of see here, you can kind of see that here, is what we call a turning point. And a turning point is just a change of direction from Act 1 to Act 2, so it's the thing that changes the character's goals. And then turning point 2 towards the end between Act 2 and Act 3, this is the final twist that's going to lead towards the resolution. We'll talk more about the turning points tomorrow or next class, but this gives you a place to start thinking about this as you do the homework for tonight. This is where we're headed. We're going to talk about the hero's journey. using mythic structure as part of understanding the way our minds are designed to understand story. And it really goes back to and ties into Lisa Krone's Wired for Story. They are connected, and so we're going to learn to see how they are connected next class. What I would like you to do between now and next class is twofold. The first one is, what is your character's point A to point B? In any scene, sequence, or chapter or short story, what is their movement from point A to point B? And go through those 6 questions that we talked about. What are your character's flaws and problems? Because once you know their flaws and their problems, you can find real-life problems that would be difficult for this character. You don't want to take it easy on your characters. So find those things for your own characters for class next time. And then what I'd like you to do is watch a movie. And I'm going to leave it open. Normally I assign a particular movie, but we're all at home, and so we have to live with what we have. We are going to talk about Star Wars, the original Star Wars, specifically when I break down the 3-act story structure. I'm going to use Star Wars, so if you are familiar with it, you could rewatch it. But if you don't have that, watch any movie to see how the story uses the 3-act structure. And then after we go through the lecture next class, you can then watch the movie again and see how those things play out.